Long ago, there existed a king who had inherited his throne from his father, who'd inherited it from his father, who'd inherited it from his mother, who'd inherited it from her mother. On and on and on, the lineage went back and back and back. And of course, all of these kings and queens, in inheriting their throne, had acquired a position not through merit or particular bravery or particular skill, but sheerly through dint of birth. And the current king, like so many of his ancestors, was not particularly meritorious. He wasn't very, very brave. He wasn't terribly, terribly clever. He did not have a fantastic grasp of foreign policy. He was not astoundingly diplomatic. He was not possessed of great and amazing talents. He was, well, ordinary, really. Quite unremarkable, like actually most of the human race. Most people are, when all is said and done, fairly unremarkable. There are very few geniuses and very few fiercely brave warriors and very few fantastically gifted foreign diplomats with an amazing in-depth grasp of foreign policy. Most of us are really quite average in most respects. So the king was not particularly different from anybody else in that regards. But he did what his father had done and his grandfather and his great-grandmother and so on back through the lineage. He surrounded himself with people who were so much more remarkable than himself. That's how he was a successful monarch. And so he had a captain of the guard who was fiercely, ferociously brave, and who led a platoon of soldiers and warriors who were almost as fierce and brave as the captain of the guard himself was. He had a small army of court wizards and astrologers and diplomats and counsellors and advisors who are terribly, terribly clever and very, very good and had gone to university and learnt all sorts of amazing things which the king didn't understand whatsoever, but who could put their brains at the king's disposal in the same way that the captain of the guard could put his military might and skill and knowledge and bravery and courage at the disposal of the king. There were court artists and musicians and jugglers and acrobats and jesters, people with remarkable skills and talents who could entertain or beautify the palace with wonderful artworks and woven tapestries and all manner of things the king couldn't possibly create, wouldn't even know where to start creating if somebody asked him to. He surrounded himself with talent, which is a wonderful way to run a country, if only more people realise that. But when you are really quite average and you're surrounded by people who you have handpicked to be above average, it does rub a little bit. It does annoy a little bit, because after a while you become acutely aware of how really very ordinary you are compared to other people. When you see how much better other people are at wielding a sword, or firing off a bow and arrow, or composing music, or creating wonderful works of art, or giving profound advice on matters of foreign policy or home policy or any other kind of policy. And all you can do is just sit there and applaud and look impressed and agree, because half the time you don't understand a word they're on about. And on days like that, days when the king was made all too aware of how really quite humdrum and quotidian of a person he was, he would tell the court that he was going off to survey his lands. And everyone in the court knew perfectly well he wasn't doing anything of the sort. But they would all nod and they would smile and say, "Oh, yes, Your Majesty. Oh, yes." And off he would ride, and sometimes he would go through the fields, and sometimes he would go through the forests, and sometimes he would go down to the shoreline with his horse. And he'd just walk and he'd wander, and he'd sit on a fallen log or a big old boulder down on the beach. And he'd watch the world go past, and he'd listen to the birds, or he'd listen to the crash of the waves, or the wind in the branches of the trees in the woods. And he'd just try and lose himself, and have an hour or two of not being a king, of not having to be surrounded by awfully clever people and awfully brave people and awfully talented people, where he could just be himself, and the only thing he might be surrounded by would be seagulls or pigeons or squirrels or something. And on this particular occasion, the king had rode into the forest, a little bit deeper than he'd gone normally, but he rode in. His kingdom was a very peaceful one. He had no fear of being abducted or murdered or anything like that, so no cause for concern. And after a while, the forest had got denser and denser, and the branches more low-hanging. He had to dismount from his horse, and he and the horse just walked, plodded as they went, listening to the birds, watching the squirrels, thinking what a lovely day it was. And he'd been so busy off with his thoughts and listening to the wind and the breeze and just watching the sunlight dappling through the leaves that he wasn't looking where he was going. And he tripped over a tree root and fell flat on his face. Now, normally he'd be up and roaring and thundering if he'd done such a thing in the court and falling over, because kings don't like to be embarrassed in front of their subjects. But thankfully, as he was roaring and thundering getting up, he suddenly remembered there was no one around to see, and no one would know he'd fallen flat on his face. So there was no need to get quite so angry, except he had twisted his ankle as he'd fallen, and it really hurt. And the heel had come off of his shoe. I mean, that wasn't a worry, because he was so rich he could afford a dozen new pairs like that. Indeed, he had several dozen other pairs at home in his wardrobe. But there he was, quite far from the castle, and he couldn't get on the back of the horse to ride off because the trees were so low-hanging. So he'd have to limp his way towards a path where there was enough space that he could ride back to the castle. And so, muttering and grumbling and having a right old misery on him, he limped through the woods, leading the horse, wondering where the nearest path was, because he hadn't really been paying attention to where he was going, and he was not quite sure where he was within the forest. When he got a whiff up ahead of wood smoke, and of course wood smoke means a home, probably some forester, some peasant, somebody like that. And maybe this peasant, whoever it was, could direct him back to the road, back to the path, so he could ride back rather than limp back to the castle. So he followed the scent of smoke to its source, and there indeed was a terribly humble home, really little more than a shack. And there were small children running around, throwing things at each other and playing and screaming and hollering the way small children will do the world over. And there was a roughly dressed peasant sitting on a tree stump, whittling a piece of wood and smoking an old cob pipe. And the king and his horse limped, well, the king limped, the horse didn't limp, but they limped into the glade where the house was. And the kids went quiet, and they stood and watched, and the man looked at this unexpected visitor and suddenly thought, hang on a minute, I know that profile, I've seen that profile before. And then he noticed the very, very expensive, elegant clothing and the very expensive looking horse, and the saddle and the brasses, and thought, oh, this is not a casual visitor, this is the king. And at once he was as obsequious as any peasant can be when faced with an unexpected royal visitor. He said, Your Majesty, welcome to the woods. And the king, being suitably regal, gave a wave and said, I am somewhat lost, and I need directions back to the path. Ah, said the peasant, well, you be about 12, 15-minute walk to the west. You need to go get back to the road in the path that'll take you back to the castle. I don't know why I spoke like that. And the king said, hey, very, very good, thank you. And the peasant said, I notice, Your Majesty, you were limping. Have you had an accident? And the king said, hey, I tripped over a tree root, you know. It's terribly sore, terribly sore. I tell you what, Your Majesty, you sit right here on my best stump, and I will fetch you a bucket of cold water, and you can soak your foot and it'll take the swelling down, so that your little journey back to the path will not be so unpleasant and painful. And off he went, and the king was sat up on the stump, and the peasant came back with a bucket of cold water, and they took off the king's boot, which was somewhat painful and unpleasant, and the king soaked his foot in the bucket of cold water. And the peasant said, I go and get you a drink, something to drink while you soak your foot. And off he went. And the king sat there thinking, you know, I came on this walk into the woods to get away from all these terribly clever viziers and courtiers and councillors and these terribly brave, clever, talented people. And here I am with some old peasant who knows more than I do about treating a twisted ankle. I still am probably the thickest person in this room, or in this glade. Even the peasant knows more than I do. And when said peasant returned with a flagon of beer, he saw that rather downcast look upon the king's face. He handed over the beer, and the king, who had never drunk beer in his life, he always drank terribly fine wines, found the taste a little odd at first, but very refreshing. So much so he asked for another one. And the peasant came back and he said, you look a bit more cheerful now, Your Majesty. And the king said, I was rather downcast earlier. You know, I'm forever surrounded by terribly clever people at court, of course. And sometimes it makes me realise that I don't understand half of what they're on about. And they fell to talking. And the king was enjoying the sun, and his ankle was feeling much better in the bucket of cold water, and the beer flowed. And the peasant introduced himself as Tom. And the king asked what he did, and Tom said, oh, I be an assistant forester, I be. And how much does one earn as an assistant forester? Asked the king, which of course is rather a rude question. If you're terribly, terribly rich, then money is an easy subject to talk about because you have so much of it. But if you're terribly, terribly poor, you don't normally like talking about money because the wolf is always at the door, and it's a topic of anxiety rather than of indulgence and luxury. But of course the king was thoroughly insulated from the exigencies of the world around him. I mean, he didn't know what it was to be poor, he didn't know what it was to be hungry, he didn't know what it was to be truly cold, because he was surrounded, and always had been from the moment of his birth, by luxury. And so the question, although it took Tom back a little, he realised the king wasn't being intentionally rude, he was just, well, posh, and rich, and clueless. And Tom said, well, I do earn 4 groats a month. 4 groats a month? Said the king. What on earth do you do with 4 groats a month? Thinking that he had socks that cost 5 times that. How could you possibly survive on 4 groats a month? Ah, well, Your Majesty, you see, one of the groats I earn in a month I eats. And one of the groats I earns in a month I invests. And one of the groats I earns in a month I repays. And t'other groat that I earn in a month, the 4th one, I throws away. The king was, throw away? Good Lord, man, you only earn 4 groats. How can you possibly throw one away? And what do you mean you eat a groat? I suppose one could swallow a groat down with a flagon of this lovely beer, but it wouldn't do much good, would it? Clanking around in your innards. And Tom went off to fetch a jug of beer to top up the king's now empty flagon that he was waving around in that fashion people tend to do when they're hoping for a refill. And while he was away, the king sat there thinking, even this peasant poses riddles I cannot answer. It's not just the jester at the court and all those terribly clever wizards and astrologers and counsellors and advisors. Even bloody peasants and woodsmen seem to be able to stump me with riddles. And by the time Tom returned, he still hadn't worked out the answers. Come along now, old chap. Tell me, what is it that you mean when you say you eat and you repay and you invest and throw away and all of that? What do you mean? And Tom said, well, your majesty, see, the first groat I get, I spends on food, and bread and cheese and such like, and I eat it. I don't actually eat the coin, you see, I just spend it on food, and I eat the food. Said the king. Very sensible. I see what you mean. I see what you mean. The second groat I get, see, I got my 4 kids, and I got my wife, and I feeds them, and I clothes them, and spends it on such things as they might need. Because my wife, she looks after me. And when I am old, and my wife is old, if God willing we live to be old, then if I feed my kids and clothe them and looks after them, then when I'm too old to do for myself and my wife is too old to do for herself, then our kids will look after me. See, so that groat is like an investment in the future. Yeah, said the king. See what you mean? Yeah. And the third groat? Well, see. Now, my old ma and my old pa, they live in an house 5 minutes yonder. And they are old and they are very frail and they can't do much for themselves. So I pays, with the third groat, I pays food for them and I puts towards their rent and helps them out with different things when they need things, ointments and unguents and such that the old folk need with their rheumatisms and all that. I repays them for all the goodness they showed me when I was a child, just as I hope that my children will repay me when I am as frail as they are. Yes, I see. Yeah, very good, very good. But this fourth groat that you throw away. I mean, what? I've got it. No, wait a minute. No, wait, don't tell me. You put it in a wishing well, and you hope for things. Yeah. Well, Tom looked at him and said, "No, your majesty. Ain't no wishing well round here. If there were, I wouldn't be so daft as to throw money in it. No, when I says I throw it away, I means I give it to the tax man, and bugger all good I get from it in exchange." Now, of course, if the king had been a little bit more on the ball, and hadn't had quite so much beer, he might have realised that the money that the tax man collects ultimately makes its way to the royal purse and pays for the castle and the silks and the horses and the saddles and the crowns and all the rest of it. But as I say, he'd had a few beers and it was a lovely warm day and he wasn't thinking in such terms, and he'd heard so many people muttering, not to his face, but in darkened corridors, about the bloody tax man and the hikes and the tax and all the rest of it, that he said, "Hey, yes, I see what you mean, you throw it away, yes, I suppose no one gets much good from the tax, do they? No. Well, I was thinking about this. What is your name? Tom, yes? Yes, jolly good riddle, this one, jolly good. When I get back to the court this evening, we've got a foreign dignitary coming for a banquet, and Well, usually all the terribly clever, the wizards and the astrologers and the counsellors and the court jester, they all have terribly clever conversations, and I just sit there and nod and smile. I would quite like to use this as a poser, as a riddle, to put to them, to show them that their king is not quite as daft as they think he is. Yeah. Now, I'll tell you what I'll do, Tom. I'll tell you what I'll do. I'd like to give you a little money. And he opened the pouch at his belt and he took out 5 groats. And he gave them to him. I said, no. You take this as a little thank you for this lovely beer and soaking my foot and giving me this very clever riddle. And I tell you what I do. I'll make a deal with you that if you keep stum, don't say anything. No, don't repeat this little riddle about the 4 groats to anyone until you have seen me 10 more times. Till you've seen me 10 more times. I want you to keep quiet about it. And then I will reward you with 20. Shall we say 20? That's a good round sum of money. I will reward you with 20 groats, which was, of course, more money than Tom had. Well, it would take him months and months and months to earn that much. And his jaw dropped open. And I said, oof. On my oath, Your Majesty, I swears not to say nothing to no one till I have seen you 10 more times. And just as it said that, they heard the thunder of hooves, and in to the glade came a flunkey, lying low, clinging to the back of the horse to avoid all of the low-slung branches that might otherwise knock him off. And the flunkey saw the king and jumped from the horse and said, "Ah, Your Majesty, I bring news. The royal dignitary from foreign parts has arrived somewhat early, indeed is in the castle now, and your presence is required to welcome him and so forth. And we've been looking high and low for you. Lo and behold, I found you." And the flunky saw the bucket of water, and the king said, "Hey, I tripped over you now, and this lovely gentleman here has been looking after me very, very well, very good gentleman here. The assistant forester, very nice chap. And the flunky escorted the king back to the path because the flunky knew the woods better than the king did. And they went in the direction that Tom had suggested to the king earlier, and they found the road, and the king got on the back of the horse, and they rode back to castle, and various royal duties were performed in welcoming the foreign dignitary and all of his team that he had arrived with. And that evening, the banquet was held. And terribly clever conversations were had by all the very, very wise people around the table, and the soldiers, both the captain of the guard and the military guard that the foreign visitor had brought with him. They all set to talking about all their war achievements, their war records, their medals, and the brave things they'd done, and well, everyone was being terribly clever and brave and talented and so forth. And the king sat there just muttering and mumbling banalities the way he usually did for an hour or so. And then when he saw from the corner of his eye the jester entering the courtroom, the banqueting hall, the king stood up and said, "I would like to pose you all a riddle." And the room went silent, partly because it was the king and partly because he'd never posed anyone a riddle in his life, and they were slightly taken aback. And just to make it interesting, yeah, I suggest if any of you chaps can solve it, or ladies, nodded his head towards the queen and the various ladies of the court, if any of you can solve it, by the end of the week, when our guest returns to his homeland, I will give you 100 groats. 100 groats. And here's the riddle. And he repeated the riddle that Tom had said to him earlier about the 4 groats. And he said, go on then, go on then, you're terribly clever, terribly clever. I want you to solve it. And various terribly clever people, wizards and courtiers and flunkies and astrologers and royal inventors and all manner of people had a pop. One of them said, well, perhaps the peasant is a bit, inbred the way a lot of these fellows are, and he eats one of his coins, he swallows them, he's got a big belly full of groats. And everyone had a good laugh, and the king said, no, not that at all, no. And somebody else said, well, no. He invests, you say, so clearly he buys stocks and shares. And everyone ran the court, rhubarb. Absolutely. And the king said, no, he's not one for the stock markets. No, he doesn't buy stocks and shares at all. No, nothing like that. And for a good half hour, they threw back and forth suggestions, and at each one the king scoffed, and he grew more and more proud of his own cleverness, that he was able to bamboozle them, that none of these awfully clever people, awfully talented people with their great experience of life could work out what the riddle was. And the next day, people would bump into him in corridors and say, Your Majesty, is it this? And they'd suggest whatever clever idea they'd had, and the king would go, no, not that at all. No, nice try, but sorry, old chap, no. And the next day, and the next day. And people were getting more and more irked with themselves and impressed that the king had come up with something so clever that none of them, with all of their cleverness, could solve it. And some of them were secretly wondering if it would turn out to be something so ludicrous by the end of it, they'd just be groaning with their heads in their hands. But only the flunky who had rode into the glade and found the king sitting with his foot in the bucket outside Tom's house, only he had the sudden thought that the king, who had never posed a riddle to anyone ever, or showed any great signs of cleverness, before that day, had come back that very evening with this riddle to do with peasants and groats. And what the hell did the king know about peasants? But an assistant forester, the humble woodsman, would know a great deal about peasants and handfuls of groats. And so it occurred to him that maybe the king had got this riddle from Tom. And so he rode into the forest. And eventually he found Tom's hut, and there was Tom, still sitting outside his hut, doing the forester's duties, bundling up wood for the fire, and so forth. And the flunky dismounted, and Tom, obsequious as ever, welcomed him in to sit on the best stump and have a beer, which the flunky said no thank you, because, well, he didn't want to engage in peasant drinks, not when he had fine wines waiting for him back at the castle. And the flunky raised this issue, this question of what had been said to the king. And the flunky said, well, did you pose any riddles to the king? And Tom said, I might have done, and I might not have done. And the flunky said, well, would a groat help your memory? And pushed a groat across the table to him. And Tom said, well, it might a little, and again it might not. And another groat, and another groat, and another groat was pushed across to him. Until there were 4 groats, a month's wage, sitting on the table. And Tom relented, because a month's wage is a month's wage. He relented and said what the riddle was about the 4 groats. And the flunky felt he'd made a very good bargain. For 4 groats, he'd solved the riddle of the 4 groats. and tonight he would be able to claim the prize money. And that's exactly what he did. He rode back to the castle, and there was yet another banquet in the evening. And the flunky stood up and said, "Your Majesty, I think I've worked it out." And he gave the explanation. 1 groat spent on the food, 1 groat on the children and the wife, 1 groat on the elderly parents, and 1 groat to the taxman. And the king stood up and said, "Yes, well done," and handed over the small fortune of money. And the flunky thought himself terribly clever, because even though he'd splashed out 4 groats to some dreadful peasant in the forest, he'd made 96 groats profit, which is a damn good profit. The king was not so impressed, because he had had an oath from Tom. Now, he could accept that Tom had been very kind to him, had given him plenty of beer and soaked his foot and directed him back to the path. But an oath is an oath, a promise is a promise, and that wretched peasant had promised to keep his trap shut until he'd seen the king 10 times over, and the king had not been back to that particular part of the forest, so there was no excuse for it, no excuse for it. So the very next day, he rode out and found Tom's hut again and banged on the door, and Tom came out and said, "Oh, your Majesty, oh, do have the best stump, do have some beer." "I don't want your beer, Tom. I want to know why you have broken your oath. You promised to me you would not divulge the secret of the riddle until you had seen me 10 times over. And yet you did. You told that dreadful little flunky." "Oh, but your Majesty, I kept my oath. I have seen you 10 times over." Nonsense, stuff and nonsense. I haven't been outside the castle. Even if you'd come to the market in the town, I haven't been into the town. And you certainly haven't been into the castle to see me." "Yeah, that is true, said Tom. I ain't been at the castle, I ain't been in the market, I ain't been nowhere near the town. But you arrived in my clearing, you arrived, and that was the first time I saw you. And then you gave me 5 groats, and each of those groats," and he took one out of his pouch at his belt, "each of those groats has your face on it. And when you rode off, I sat here at my table, sitting on my best stump, and I stared at those 5 coins, and I saw your face on each and every one of them. So that was 6 times I had seen you. And then this flunky feller, he comes riding in a day ago, and he puts 4 more coins on the table in front of me. And I looks at them, and I sees your face on each one of them. And so I have seen you 10 times, your Majesty." And the king sat down rather heavily on the stump. And he tried to get angry and have a go at Tom, but he had to admit Tom was right. He had seen the king's face 10 times. "Hey, you're a jolly clever chap, aren't you?" said the king. And he dipped into his pouch at his belt, and he brought out a handful of groats and slapped them down on the table. He said, "I'll have another beer with you. And I tell you what, old chap, the head forester, terribly old, I hear, is about to retire any time now. And so when he retires, I insist that you take up his job, his position as head forester. For a chap as clever as you should not be some mere assistant, should be the head." And so Tom not only had that extra fistful of groats, but within the month he had been promoted to head forester, with a big old pay rise and a much nicer house for him and his wife and his children and his elderly parents to live in all together under the same roof. And the king became a fairly regular visitor to the house, for whenever the king was stumped by some problem, and had just got a little bit fed up with how terribly clever everyone at the castle was, and they'd always talk over his head and he wouldn't understand half of what they said most of the time. He knew he could come and talk to Tom, who would speak to him plainly, simply, straightforwardly, and every single time give him a sensible answer. Thank you.